Hello. I am deeply grateful for the honor of being here with you and for the opportunity to convey some of the ideas that hold immense importance regarding the government that we are presently implementing in Argentina. Your presence and attention mean a great deal to me, and I feel truly privileged to have this platform to discuss the significant initiatives and policies that are shaping the future of our nation. Thank you once again for your kind hospitality and for allowing me to contribute to this meaningful dialogue. Good day. By nature, I am always an economist, and there are certain issues that become of utmost importance, particularly when it comes to the process of making decisions and determining the best course of action to take, especially in terms of their impact on overall outcomes. In the talk I am delivering today, my primary focus will be on one of the subjects that I explore in great detail in my most recent publication titled Capitalism, Socialism, and the Neoclassical Trap, which was just released and is now available for readers to delve into. Essentially, I would like to discuss a concept known as market failure, which refers to non-convexity. Non-convexity occurs when there are concentrated market structures, and the impact of regulation on innovation and economic growth is examined. In this context, it is argued that regulation has the potential to stifle innovation and hinder economic growth. In that sense, essentially the talk is divided into a total of 5 distinct parts, each covering a specific aspect of the topic at hand. The initial step I will take is to outline the logic of the conceptual structure of what I will be presenting. I will also explain the key elements behind the argumentation. After that, I will begin to elaborate on where I believe the neoclassical structure encounters a problem, a flaw, or an error. This in turn leads to state intervention, which ultimately results in the suppression of economic growth. Basically, the first element of the conceptual framework is an idea from Mises. Mises made the observation that there were exclusively 2 polar economic systems in existence. Is that statement accurate or correct? In other words, on one hand, we have free market capitalism, and on the other extreme, we encounter real socialism. That concept, combined with a piece by Hayek, let's say, highly renowned, which is the publication The Road to Serfdom. The book titled The Road to Serfdom emphasized that whenever there was state intervention, the final outcome invariably turned out to be more detrimental than the initial state of affairs that existed prior to intervention. There is a quote from Milton Friedman, an economist who spent a significant amount of time at the Huber Institute, stating that, in general, attempting to correct a market failure through state intervention often leads to outcomes that are worse than the original situation. And fundamentally, what Hayek pointed out in The Road to Serfdom is that every time there was an intervention, the resulting outcome was worse. This, in turn, motivated politicians to implement new interventions, leading not only to a deteriorating functioning of the system, but also implying an increasing weight of the state. Ultimately, this dynamic path led to socialism, and as a consequence, to widespread misery and suffering. Therefore, let's say it is crucial to have a comprehensive understanding of the logics and dynamics that also play a pivotal role in leading to that outcome. The first point regarding the impossibility of socialism was already raised in 1922 by Mises in his book Socialism, where he explicitly stated that socialism was unworkable due to its inability to perform economic calculation and allocate resources efficiently. To clarify more specifically, if what one is doing in a transaction is exchanging property rights, and that is what generates a historical record known as price, and that functions as a signaling mechanism where agents coordinate their actions, with some acting as buyers and others as sellers, and in the presence of divergences or discrepancies, there will be necessary adjustments made to ensure alignment and balance in the transaction process. That is to say, the price system is a mechanism for transmitting information, coordination, and adjustment. The occurrence is initiated by the exchange of rights pertaining to the ownership or possession of property. Therefore, when the state appears and intervenes, what it is doing is interfering with the right to property. And by interfering with the right to property, the signal begins to experience noise. And the greater the intervention that occurs, the more the right to property is violated and infringed upon. The signal that is transmitted becomes worse with each successive occurrence. And at the limit, in real socialism without private property, there is no price system, and therefore the system collapses. That's why in all the places where socialism was implemented, it was a failure economically, socially, and culturally. In addition, as it further exacerbates the violence of politicians, they have ultimately ended up killing a staggering number of 150 million innocent human beings. Another problem that is also of great importance and falls within these issues that are being generated with the presence of socialism and state intervention is that it also creates a lack of compatibility in incentives. Because if you are going to be making money and you strive to make money, as Milton Friedman used to say, let's say, what it has to do with the social responsibility of the entrepreneur is to make money and prioritize profit generation, as emphasized by Friedman's perspective on the subject. I mean, if he does it, he's a hero because he's producing higher quality goods at a better price. Therefore, he's a creator of well-being. And in the event that you intervene with the argument of income distribution and inequality and those kinds of issues that socialism attacks, the counter-argument is, why should I make an effort if they are going to take away the fruits of my labor and the rewards that I have earned? And in the event that I am unable to own the fruit of my labor, then it does not make sense for me to continue working and investing my efforts. Furthermore, in reality, the presence of socialism directly addresses the processes of discovery and exploration. And that is not a minor problem. I mean, in fact, Hayek pointed out that the market is a process of discovering new things. Hayek posed this in terms of the discussion on income distribution, stating that there was no such thing as a fixed pie, but rather that the pie was not a pre-existing entity, but rather a pie that was constantly being created and discovered through the unfolding market process. However, this is extremely significant because government interference ultimately disrupts the process of discovery, which is essentially the driving force behind innovation and hinders the ability to make new and groundbreaking advancements. Let's consider two individuals who are not connected. One generates a product and has a waste, and in fact that waste would like to get rid of it, even willing to pay for someone to take that waste away. And it may happen that on the other side there could be another individual for whom that waste could serve as input and would be willing to pay for it. But then a third person appears and finds a business opportunity, which is to purchase from the first individual and sell to the second individual. That is to say, and he does that because he is going to derive benefit from it. And if that benefit actually solves the problem for two individuals, then it is wonderful. Remember that the first one was willing to pay just to have it taken away, and the second one was desperate to get it in order to carry out his project. So this third person obviously is going to succeed because he is solving a problem, and if the government intervenes by regulating it, what will happen is it will interfere with that process, it will terminate it, and if the government advances too much, it will directly terminate it, and therefore we will all live much worse. Perhaps, let's say, the most emblematic case was during the pandemic, with the masks, for instance, highlighting the importance of wearing them for public health and safety. If they had let market forces operate freely, there would have been many more masks, much faster and much cheaper. And the fact that the state intervened only created a big problem. As a result, in economies with less government intervention, the impact of this policy was detrimental and caused significant harm. In highly intervened economies, such as the case of Argentina, it resulted in Argentina experiencing a significant number of 130,000 deaths from COVID, whereas if we had taken action similar to a mediocre country, we would have had a much lower count of 30,000 deaths. In other words, states' presentation of intervention to Argentines cost 100,000 lives in a year. In other words, state intervention ultimately leads to a direct or indirect loss of life, making it a killer intervention that has fatal consequences. And this, let's say, is important because there is also this combination of the market as a process of discovery and, let's say, Locke's principle of appropriation, which states that whoever discovers it keeps it, is the basis of Israel Kirchner's thinking on these issues, where he presents the market as a process of discovery. If you intervene in it for whatever reason, it is generally done for distributive reasons, and you will end up causing harm, which is something that should be avoided to maintain the integrity and effectiveness of the market as a mechanism for allocating resources. I will present them with another case, and I will not delve further into this, but let us suppose I have a general equilibrium system that is initially in balance, and suddenly a problem arises, such as a pandemic, and then you have a drastic change in demand that disrupts the equilibrium of the system, leading to an imbalance that needs to be addressed. That significant change in demand will result in certain products being highly sought after, and as a consequence, their price will inevitably be very high in the short term. Precisely that price signal is what will bring resources from locations where they should not be to locations where people are demanding resources, effectively reallocating them based on market demand. If you, in the name of discussing income distribution, profits, inequality, and so on, start intervening in that market, the only thing you will achieve is the destruction of the market that was supposed to be destroyed. But the market that should thrive does not thrive, and therefore ultimately we are all much worse off. Hence, one of the crucial aspects to clarify is that government intervention is consistently negative, as it relies on the use of force and coercion to enforce its policies and decisions, and nothing relying on force can be considered good. In reality, liberalism is founded on the principles of respecting the right to life, freedom, property, and above all, the principle of non-aggression, which serves as the fundamental and initial premise. And if there is a large and institutionalized aggressor, it is the state. Therefore, the action of the state always causes harm, and the more state there is, the worse off we are. In this line of reasoning, then, where intervention only serves to cause harm and yields no positive outcomes, this is a tremendous development because the neoclassical analytical framework, even with people who consider themselves libertarian, could end up being functional to socialism if it embraces the models and takes into account what is referred to as market failures. This has significant implications for the intersection of economic ideologies and the potential impact on policy decisions and societal outcomes in the long run. Due to the definition of market failure supposedly enabling intervention, intervention is considered necessary. And there, I would like to make some reflections, because one of the things that becomes evident when working in the business world is that individuals rely on models to guide their decision-making processes. The question that arises is, why are models so widely used in this context? Owing to the intricate nature of reality, simplification is utilized as a means to enhance comprehension and prioritize the genuinely significant elements of one's endeavors, enabling a clearer understanding of what is being done and allowing for a focused approach towards what truly matters. However, when the model does not accurately represent reality, one should discard the model. In other words, it is important not to become angry with reality when it does not align with the model. If you're in a company and become angry with reality and cling to the model, you will lose your jobs because you will be losing a significant amount of money. So the primary aspect that an individual, let's say, acquires when in the trench is to comprehend that if the model does not accurately represent reality, the model becomes irrelevant and cannot be relied upon for decision-making. However, in the neoclassical world, when reality does not correspond to the model, we refer to it as a market failure phenomenon. To clarify, I want to convey that we are suffering from a dangerous level of arrogance, including myself. This is because I have been teaching microeconomics for 25 years, and during this time I have extensively studied the subject and kept up with the latest developments by reading numerous microeconomics books, as well as staying updated on new models and papers. However, everything took a different turn when I came across Murray Newton Rothbard's work titled Monopoly and Competition. That particular day marked a significant turning point in my life, altering my perspective and transforming the way I approach the subject matter. However, what I intend to convey is that by enabling the concept of market failure and intervention, we ultimately end up favoring socialism. In other words, our actions inadvertently contribute to the functionality of socialism, which is contrary to our original intentions and beliefs. In fact, within the strategy of 21st century socialism and the way to advance in economies, where Latin America is a great example, let's say, 21st century socialism has been very successful in Latin America. It has had many presidents. In Argentina, there were 4 Kirchnerist periods. In Uruguay, they had Pepe Mujica, Tabaré Vázquez. In Chile, they had Lago, Bachelet twice, Boric now in Paraguay, Lugo in Brazil. They had 2 governments of Lula, one of Dilma Rousseff, then Lula again. They have Petro in Colombia, Castillo in Peru, López Obrador in Mexico. I think I'm not forgetting any. And then in Spain, they have Pedro Sanchez, who is somewhat like a Kirchnerist, and I wouldn't say he has good manners because he doesn't have them now. However, it is important to note that the success of 21st century socialism in Latin America has not been without its challenges and controversies. There have been debates and criticisms surrounding its implementation and impact on the economy. Nonetheless, the presence of multiple socialist leaders in various Latin American countries is a testament to the influence and appeal of this ideology in the region. It has shaped political landscapes, driven policy changes, and sparked passionate discussions among both supporters and detractors. Overall, 21st century socialism has left a significant mark on Latin America's political and economic history, and its legacy continues to be a topic of interest and analysis. So that is a favorable outcome. And what is our course of action after that? Well, one of the things I intend to do is to identify these issues, propose some potential solutions, but of course, let's assume I feel it is important to notify you that this is a crucial part of my upcoming project that I am currently collaborating on with Dr. Demian Radel, whom I also have the privilege of having as one of my esteemed advisors by my side. But I say I will be giving some clues about where I think the solution lies. So the first thing is to define what a market is. I find it fundamental, and sometimes I get the feeling that a large number of economists don't possess the knowledge of how to define what a market is. In fact, some reflections that are made to me confirm to me that they do not know what the market is. And as far as I'm concerned, the market in return, is my definition. What I think, let's say, is absolutely up for discussion. I have no objections or concerns with that. And the market is a process of social cooperation where property rights are exchanged voluntarily by individuals participating in the market. In other words, you exchange property rights with another individual, with another agent of your own free will. And if you do it voluntarily, there can be no mistake. By definition, you are engaging in the exchange willingly, without any coercion or error. That does not mean that I assume that I go and purchase a pair of shoes, and the pair of shoes I thought would provide me with a certain benefit, and I do not like it. Well, I was mistaken, but I fix it. However, there was no failure in that decision. I made a mistake in my judgment, but it was not a complete failure. To clarify, at the specific moment when I made the decision, it was exactly what I wanted to do, and I carried it out of my own accord. Nobody coerced me into making that transaction. And the sole agent operating within the economy that carries out those compelled transactions is the state. Thus, the sole entity with the capability to generate failures within the economy is the state, not to mention the market, because in actuality, we ourselves are the market participants. When discussing the market, we represent the market. We are the market. Therefore, why should we be subjected to the presence of someone who is fatally arrogant and claims that I am making the wrong decision, even though they are unaware of my actions and the reasons behind them? To clarify, undoubtedly, let us assume, in the event that I were to go watch the Los Angeles Lakers, undoubtedly a fan of the Boston Celtics would definitely argue that I am wrong. On what grounds would they base their argument? If I like the Los Angeles Lakers, I saw Magic Johnson play, I say they come to explain to me, I say I am wrong. I enjoy the colors yellow and purple. In addition, purple represents freedom and progress, which makes me like it even more. So, and this is extremely fascinating, this happens to me on a regular basis in public discussions. Someone, a supporter of statism, explicitly states that there it is, the world governed by my law creates these problems that we are currently facing in our society and need to address urgently. So I say, okay, let's see if the world of my law generates these problems. I mean, besides the fact that there are powerful forces that I am causing problems myself. So I express because there are thoughts that go through my mind that obviously I cannot share due to the ongoing restriction I have as the head of state in my current position. So when you hear something or see that I pause for a brief moment, I kindly ask you please to kindly try to understand me and my perspective. So one of the points I make is, if you believe there is a market failure in a specific market, the initial test I propose is to check if there is no intervention from the state or any form of government involvement or regulation whatsoever. Because it may not be that what you're perceiving as a market failure is actually the harm caused by state action. And if you eliminated the state from the equation, we would definitely be in a more advantageous position. Therefore, the primary and foremost point is to promptly proceed and thoroughly examine whether the state is actively involved in the matter at hand. At this moment, if you witnessed, proceeded, verified, and the state is not involved, I strongly suggest you go back and reanalyze because the information provided is incorrect. To clarify clearly, God, I'm a libertarian liberal, so, well, what I'm going to provide is the justification for why I express my opinions in the way that I do. So the question at hand is, how can I, for instance, be motivated by all of this that has transpired before me? One of the experiences that I had as a result of engaging in extensive study of microeconomics and general equilibrium was that when the modern literature on economic growth emerged, it did not seem very approachable or user-friendly to me. In contrast, the idea of microfounded seemed quite straightforward and easy to grasp. This sparked my interest in delving deeper into the field of economic growth, and I eventually specialized in exploring various topics related to economic growth, both with and without the influence of monetary factors. Something that is also, let's say, motivated by the fact that the most important economist in Argentine history, Miguel Sidrowski, was a specialist in economic growth with monetary matters and the impact of money on the economy. So I already had, let's say, a certain attraction to that, and all the micro foundations had been extremely useful to me. And having also taught mathematical economics classes had greatly helped me in my understanding. So I started working on these topics, and at one point I was invited to give a talk at the World Economic Forum, not the last one. When I made such a fuss as a calmer person, they invited me to speak about demography, specifically about the relationship between demography and growth. It was a great opportunity for me to share my insights and contribute to the discussions on this important subject. I was grateful for the chance to be part of such a prestigious event and to engage with experts from around the world. When I commence my investigation, I come across the works of Angus Maddison, and I encounter something that is widely known to all of you, even though I will provide a description of it, but surely all of you are already acquainted with it, which is what is commonly referred to as the hockey stick. That series presented by Angus Maddison covers 2,000 years of history, starting from year zero, the Christian era, up to the year 2000, and we ascertained that the per capita gross domestic product remained virtually constant for a span of 1,800 years, with only a 40% increase in per capita GDP in what pertains to the 16th century, that is, subsequent to the discovery of America and its implications on the economy. And the truth is that it was an incredibly monotonous series, a series that, let's say, if one stopped around the year 1800 and had to choose between sticking with Adam Smith or Malthus, it seemed most reasonable to stick with Malthus due to his more relevant insights for the time period. However, let us assume, after the Industrial Revolution, the gross domestic product per capita experienced a significant increase of approximately 10 times. And this occurrence takes place in a context where the population has multiplied by a minimum of 7 times compared to its original size. So, when confronted with that particular situation, what becomes apparent is that we are dealing with the presence of an escalating trend towards higher returns on investment. We have a larger number of individuals entering the market, and yet productivity experiences an increase if the gross domestic product per capita rises, indicating that the predictions made by Malthus did not come true as he had anticipated. And that, let's say, the presence of increasing returns is evident and cannot be ignored. In other words, in market failure terminology, they are referred to as non-convexities, or if you would rather phrase it differently, it signifies the existence of concentrated market structures. The problem is that if you frame it in microeconomic terms, that is considered a market failure, or to put it differently, monopolies are viewed as negative and detrimental to the economy. So if monopolies are considered to be harmful, or concentrated market structures are considered to be harmful, how can we make the claim that it is indeed harmful? If in the year 1800 more than 95% of the population resided below the extreme poverty line, and by the year 2000 that number had decreased significantly to less than 10% of the population. So something that generated such a significant amount of well-being, or that generated such a significant amount of well-being from the perspective of microeconomics, let's say, was that incorrect? There exist numerous answers. The easiest, simplest, most obvious answer, one could already find it in a very nice book, a small book, a popular science book that is widely available and highly recommended for its clarity and comprehensibility. Moreover, in the most recent edition in Spanish, it features a prologue that was written by me. Additionally, my initial encounter with the book, which resulted in a conflict, may explain why I pursued a career in politics, as I have a fondness for conflict. However, besides the humor, there is a book written by Henry Hazlitt with the title Economics in One Lesson that provides valuable insights into economics and its principles. He begins by asking, well, what is the choice in economics? He differentiates between the bad economist and the good economist. He states that the poor economist is the one who concentrates solely on one market in a solitary period of time, while the excellent economist not only examines one market, but examines all the others, and not only takes into account the outcomes of what occurs today, but also takes into consideration the implications for the future. That is to say, he is talking about an economist. The bad economist is one who only does partial equilibrium and for a single period, and the good economist does general intertemporal equilibrium. In other words, that would be the definition. However, apart from this, the most significant thing then is, well, how do we trace the issue? Where exactly is the problem located that we need to address and resolve? So, at this moment, I am going to disclose the answer to you, and after that, I will furnish the explanations from my perspective. The problem stems from the interpretation of the invisible hand, the concept of the invisible hand under Pareto's logic, which renders the invisible hand incompatible with the idea of the pin factory, that is, increasing returns. As one progresses in the formal structuring of efficiency analysis, let's say, by choosing certain mathematical constructs, it brings the invisible hand into dispute with the pin factory, creating a conflict between these two ideas. This conflict arises due to the differing implications of the invisible hand and the pin factory as one delves deeper into the formal analysis of efficiency. And that has clear analytical consequences. And starting from that framework, when we incorporate normative issues into equilibrium analysis, that is where this conflict between reality and the model begins to emerge, a conflict that we call market failures. This conflict arises due to the disparity between the actual state of affairs and the theoretical representation, highlighting the limitations of the model. So let's say when the issue of non-convexities arises, it is related to concentrated market structures, monopolies. We can have the case of public goods, for example. There is something very intriguing and captivating about topics that are related to public goods. We often have discussions in terms of public goods, rivalry in consumption, and exclusion, considering their implications for resource allocation and societal well-being. And when one looks then, for instance, at the emblematic case that was utilized to depict a situation where competition in consumption was not adequately addressed and exclusion was the primary issue pertaining to lighthouses. And in one of those meetings that Milton Friedman and other economists had in Chicago, a lawyer used to participate who obviously was not contaminated with all the neoclassical tools that we economists at the base are contaminated with. So he found very amusing solutions, and then they would say, well, the emblematic case was the lighthouses and the lighthouses and the lighthouses. So this individual, this attorney who eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics, who had a lifespan of 104 years, if my memory serves me correctly, was named Ronald Coase, according to my recollection. So, what did he do? He went and analyzed all the lighthouses from the 19th century. Supposedly it was a landmark case of market failure and the issue of public goods where state intervention was deemed necessary. And guess what he discovered? To his surprise, he found that all of the lighthouses were actually privately owned, contrary to popular belief. That is to say, it's not that economists don't know how to, let's say, describe the problem well. The real issue is that we have tools that are flawed. And this is a subject, the subject of public goods, that I am going to discuss with you. I believe that when I inform you about it, you will think it's a joke, but trust me, in real life it is not, especially not in Argentina. This is a matter of great significance and deserves our attention and consideration. It might be affected, let's say, by the case, but let's suppose that you have two communities separated by a river, and then you discover that if you build a bridge, you could establish a means of communication and interaction with the other community, enabling the exchange of goods, services, and ideas, fostering mutual growth and development between the two communities. They are currently expanding the market size, which means they will have a greater division of labor, higher productivity, and increased well-being. By the way, I noticed you have a shirt from Boca Juniors there. Well, that is populism, a political approach that seeks to appeal to the interests and concerns of ordinary people. No, but that was when he was a goalie. No, that doesn't count. However, it's doubly populist. Subsequently, they come to the realization that it would be highly advantageous to construct a bridge in that. So what's happening? If it was just a problem of the private sector, you know what they do? They come to an agreement, get together, and build the bridge. They figure it out. The problem arises when the state is involved. Then the state comes in, taxes everyone, and builds the bridge. But then there are a lot of people who live off the state. So what do? They start looking, they create the Ministry of Bridges, and they start looking for where to build bridges. There comes a point when they have built all the bridges that could be built. So they establish the Ministry of Water to provide water before building a bridge. You are laughing. I kindly ask you to please review the organizational chart of the Public Service Department. Luckily, let's say, here I have with me, who is accompanying me, this formidable, wonderful professional, who is my Minister of Economy, Luis Caputo, who is the one wielding the chainsaw. And from that, we are getting a lot of things. I want to tell you that it makes me very happy when you applaud my Minister of Economy, because not only is he making the largest adjustment in Argentine history, but it is also the largest in the history of humanity, in terms of depth and duration. When you combine, let's say, what we are doing in the Treasury and the Central Bank, in fact, we have already adjusted more than 13 percentage points of GDP, and that, let's say, if you had mentioned it at a different time, let's say, they would criticize both of us in the middle of 9 de Julio Avenue, where there is an obelisk, a tall, prominent structure there, and then I escort you to the presentations and they give applause. It's a change of era. People are awakening the ideas of freedom. And the man who is carrying it out is the beloved Luis Caputo, who is here. Thank you. Clearly, there is an additional type of presumed market failure that we could analyze. I mean, externalities. You take into account the case of externalities, for example. Externalities, consumption externalities. In reality, consumption externalities are in place to ensure that this point is avoided, thereby eliminating the problem of circularity in resolving the general equilibrium issue. Do you think people are too dumb to decide? There will come a time when they'll starve, so let's say they'll make a decision in order to avoid death. So I do not require someone to intervene to solve the externality for me because ultimately someone will resolve it. Or let's say cases of externality in production. How many times have you seen in textbooks, let's say, the company that pollutes the sea, the water? It is actually a problem related to the definition of property. In fact, one of the brilliant aspects that Coase also addressed and resolved was the issue of effectively resolving these problems by assigning and clarifying property rights. Another problem is the presence of asymmetric information, where it is evident that involving the state is preferable, as we can address this issue more effectively by being directly involved, compared to someone who would only observe it from a distance. And another incredibly arrogant aspect is the problem of coordination failure due to an issue with the prisoner's dilemma. If you have observed that there is a significant assumption in the prisoner's dilemma, namely that the prisoners are unable to interact. I mean, you all comprehend and acknowledge that such a seemingly straightforward assumption carries a significant and alarming level of institutional violence. And thus, while I grasp and insert that degree of gross institutional violence, I now require a violent entity to address the coordination problem at hand, as if the agents were idiots. And the agents are not idiots, the agents are intelligent. The problem is that there are a bunch of tyrants in the middle called the state who live off our money, and that's why they create these problems. For what? To live like that? Not for us to be better off. That is, they create their own demand. Why? Because they have the coercive power of the state in the middle. The person in the state realizes they can regulate something that will happen to them with the regulators, and it's important for them to have it as they are in that office and need to justify why they are warming the seat, creating regulations to justify their existence and ruin our lives in the process. I mean, this is not insignificant because this has direct implications on how it negatively impacts innovation. For instance, it hinders progress and stifles creativity. They regulate due to lack of knowledge, necessity to warm the seat, various reasons, and negatively impact our lives. And in addition, I will provide you with further information when you have monopolies. And this is significant because we already have knowledge that growth, for example, we will need to elucidate it through the concept of increasing returns. When you start regulating and you look at any regulatory model, one of the things that happens is that when you regulate, given the normative framework that implies the competitive model, you regulate those monopolies to resemble the competitive model as closely as possible. And if you don't achieve that, well, it should resemble the second best solution, which is the Ramsey. In that specific context, the implementation of that regulation is anticipated to effectively eliminate quasi-rent, which is the surplus income derived from the control of a resource or asset. And in the event that you eliminate quasi-rent, you are effectively eliminating the incentives that drive innovation. And if you regulate, assimilate competitive companies, and take away quasi-rents, what you are doing is killing innovation and therefore killing economic growth. So when you start regulating, what will be the flip side? It will be that you won't grow. Which is the world region that experiences the least growth by far? Europe. And why doesn't it grow? Because they are overcrowded with regulations. They became so fanatical about creating a model that resembles the competitive model that they killed increasing returns. In other words, they eliminated quasi-rents. By doing so, they lack incentives to invest. If they do, there is no innovation, thus no economic growth. Therefore, let's not permit these fatally arrogant individuals to demolish our lives with regulations. Let's move towards a much freer society. Yes, and if the problem lies in economic theory, let's try to identify where the error in economic theory is. Let's not say that the world resembles an economic theory that has errors, coming from a world that had no growth. That is to say, Edwards' box can be very amusing, let's say, when there is no growth in a static economy, just like Matthews, just like increasing marginal returns, but that is not the real world. So what do? Do I stick with the model or do I stick with reality? Oh no, since reality makes me uncomfortable, I'll stick with the model and say that the problem is reality. Let's not fall into that madness, because in that madness we will destroy our lives. In that sense, then it is good. So what do we do now? Where do we go from here? What actions should we take? What is our next move? So one of the things I did, I said, well, I'm not going to review the whole history because I don't have the time. And if you have to, for something, having studied the history of economic thought has some advantages that say, well, let's see, where do I make the cut? So I said, well, let's go to Adam Smith, the renowned economist. So I mentioned, well, let's initiate with Adam Smith. Although, let's suppose you are probably conscious that I am a libertarian liberal. I adhere to the Austrian school of economics, that philosophically I am actually an anarcho-capitalist, and that in real life I am a minarchist. Unlike my colleagues, I do not have a negative view of Adam Smith. In fact, to me, Adam Smith appears to be a total genius, an individual of exceptional intellect and profound insight into economics, whose ideas continue to resonate and inspire me greatly. In my opinion, Adam Smith is equivalent to mathematics in economics, as mathematics has been to cause. That is to say, an individual who was 2 centuries ahead of their time and was the person who witnessed it with their own eyes. We possess an exceedingly distinctive approach to engaging in politics. So conventional analysts question us, and we mockingly dismiss them while asserting that they fail to perceive it in its entirety and comprehend the intricacies of our methods. Well, Adam Smith witnessed it. In that sense, essentially, according to my interpretation of Adam Smith, the remarkable aspect of Adam Smith's work was his implicit understanding of the model for economic growth, which makes him a significant figure in the field of economics. That is to say, Adam Smith's model focuses on research on the nature and causes of wealth, nations for friends, wealth of nations. What it has is a model of economic growth. In actuality, the concept of the pin factory revolves around the idea of achieving economies of scale, as it conveys the message that if there is only one person involved in the production of pins, regardless of their skill level, the output will be restricted to a mere 20 units, with no possibility of exceeding that quantity. At present, what he was expressing is that when he divided the work into 15 distinct activities, the per capita production of pins experienced a significant jump, reaching a remarkable figure of 5,000. To clarify, you had significantly amplified the workforce by a factor of 15, and production had undergone a remarkable transformation, surging from a mere 20 to an astounding 5,000 per capita. And then he says there is something very interesting, and that in light of what is being woven and carved regarding interpretations of the future, especially with the wonder that is artificial intelligence, which is the exacerbation of increasing returns, especially for those dystopian equilibriums that are characterized by a state of imbalance and instability, we must carefully consider the potential ramifications and consequences of such advancements. In my opinion, I would advise not to be overly fearful of dystopian equilibriums, as the concept of the pin factory and the benefits of increasing returns and the division of labor do have their limitations that should be considered and understood. And what is the limit? The size of the market. In other words, I am not going to bring, let us say, 15 to 15, let us say, employees to the pin factory, and then I would have a total of 50,075 pins, which amounts to 1,000 pins per employee available for sale. If I can't sell them, I won't go to that level of difficulty in work. I'll go to the level, let's say, that the market supports my efforts. That is to say, then contemplate, don't simply think about the process from the supply side, but rather contemplate and consider the demand on the other side as well. I mean, let's not revert to the problems we encountered in the past with the intense hatred towards machines. That is, with the Luddites who oppose technological advancements and automation. I mean, because you see, on the day Edison invented the light bulb, the candle makers, let's say, were extremely upset, and understandably so, given that their livelihood was now at stake due to this revolutionary invention. They were extremely furious. Therefore, the actuality is that what Edison did was truly remarkable and astonishing, isn't it? Because it enabled me to have a higher quality product at a better price, reaching more people, while creating more jobs, saving money, and being able to spend on other goods. That is to say, a machine for generating well-being. That is to say, those who generate technological progress are machines for generating well-being, but they can never go beyond the market limit unless there is innovation that makes us all richer, that makes us all better off. So let's not be afraid. Let's not ask for regulations just because we don't understand what it's about. Let's try to understand what it's about instead of regulating. In other words, freedom can never be bad. What's bad is not being free. Innovation is never bad. Finally, let's say, we can discuss the values on which innovation is built. What if we build them on the values of libertarianism? I mean, who could be against that? On the respect for others' life project, in defense of the right to life, liberty, property, based on the principle of non-aggression. What's the problem with that? Who's against that? I mean, only you could be successful by serving others. It leads to better quality, a better price. But there's a limit. The limit is the size of the market. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to regulate. Let's say technological progress will have demand as its counterpart on the other side. Or do you believe that technological progress will be created for beings that do not exist? How can they be engaging in such madness and investing a significant amount of money into it when in actuality that money originates from human beings? And I'm not saying they're going to throw money just for the sake of it. I don't know any entrepreneurs who spend money just to burn it for fun. Another highly intriguing aspect of Adam Smith's work is that he placed great emphasis on the concept of learning through practice. In other words, the model of learning by doing was of utmost importance to him, and it also considered technological progress. Because basically what Adam Smith was saying was that a person in their work, every time they did it more times, they did it better each time. That is learning by doing. And at a certain point, they discovered a method to generate the identical thing, but with reduced labor, and there occurred a distinct leap. This distinct leap, which we refer to as technological progress. This implies that Adam Smith not only took into account the concept of increasing returns, but he also addressed the division of labor, clearly established its boundaries, and had a growth model that incorporated learning through practical experience and technological advancement. In the year 1776, taking into consideration the fact that it also took him a total of 10 years to write the book. If you do not inform me that he was not advanced, I do not have a clear understanding of what the term advanced means. Another intriguing aspect is the presence of free markets and minimal state intervention, which adds to the overall interest of the topic. And that, let's say, the corollary of that is the invisible hand, where each one, guided by their own interest, leads to the general welfare. And on the monetary level, well, he had a gold standard model. Now, once we have Adam Smith's work, it is clear that today it is easy. Let's say, knowing the results, we know that Adam Smith was right, but at that time it was not so evident. Standing in 1776, it was not evident. And that's why you have to, in the year 1801, if I'm not mistaken, but let's say around that time, or around 800 or a similar number, there appeared the work of Malthus, and the idea of diminishing marginal returns didn't seem crazy in light of what had been for example, the previous 800 years. And also, prior to year zero, it did not differ significantly from what came after until the year 1800. And that made sense because it was stated that when an individual arrived, they selected the most favorable piece of land, and when the subsequent individual arrived, they chose a smaller one, and this pattern continued. Hence, the marginal productivity was diminishing. Yes, and that resulted in a decrease in real wages, let's say, making them progressively lower over time. And that, let's say, then Malthus interacted with it. Let's say with a passion for the sexes, he reached the iron law of wages and derived a plethora of aberrant relationships that we won't be discussing now, but aberrant relationships that had been going on for many years. However, it is not the primary focus of the discussion at this moment to go into detail on this topic. And that concept, let's say, was further developed by Ricardo, by Stuart Mill, until it eventually reached Marx. And the reality is that at that moment is when the theory emerges, the neoclassical theory surpassing the classics, and it is the topic of the subjective theory of value, where Menger appears on one side, Queen Stavangabos on the other, and Leon Valra contribute their unique perspectives to the discourse on this subject matter. I mention it because it is important, as at some point economic theory will have to go back in history after Keynes, and that will be relevant, let's say, in the context of future economic analysis, where they will draw inspiration and insights from the foundations laid by Keynesian economics. And in that sense, as we move into the 20th century, it becomes clear that Malthus's analysis was incorrect, that Adam Smith's proposal was accurate, that there was the issue of increasing returns, and that if one desired to explain economic growth using constant returns to scale and neoclassical tools in that format, it did not work, especially not with diminishing marginal returns, which ultimately proved to be a significant factor in understanding the limitations of the neoclassical approach to explaining economic growth and development in the context of the 20th century. So the first two individuals who witnessed this phenomenon were Alfred Marshall and Alvin Young, and they commenced to determine how they could integrate the concept of increasing returns into the framework of the models in order to elucidate the phenomenon of economic growth. And this debate was of such great importance and intensity that it is at this point in time when discussions about monopoly began. And over there you will encounter Joan Robinson's theory of monopoly, or let's say highly interesting models like Chamberlain's that revolve around monopolistic competition. In other words, during that time, there was a comprehensive climate aimed at trying to identify the whereabouts of the issue of increasing returns and how to incorporate them into what we now refer to as macroeconomic analysis or economic growth in order to explain economic growth. He mentioned that there was a specific problem, right? However, when Keynes made his appearance, the problem with his ideas was that they completely undermined and dismantled the entire analytical framework that had existed before his time, causing a significant disruption and requiring a re-evaluation of previous economic theories and models. In other words, the general theory is a masterpiece, but a masterpiece of evil terror that is filled with malevolence and instills a sense of dread. I don't want to start talking about Keynes because if I do this, it's going to take me 7 hours. And I have a bunch of meetings that I won't be able to attend. Will I make an effort to try and see how the model worked in order to gain a better understanding of its functionality and performance? How did macroeconomic analysis work before Keynes? It wasn't called macroeconomics, but it doesn't matter. Today we can think of it that way. They were what were referred to as the Vixel models, which were models of an intertemporal nature, where the interaction between saving and investment determined the interest rate, which is referred to as the Vixelian interest rate. That is to say, as the interest rate being a mechanism of intertemporal coordination, which is simply the price of present goods compared to future goods. And in the money market, the price level was determined. In other words, it was a model with intertemporal characteristics, where in the goods market, relative prices were determined, and if we switch to an intertemporal criterion, savings and investment determined the interest rate. And that had to have all relative prices aligned in terms of goods so that everyone agreed they had the same interest rate to avoid intertemporal arbitrages and maintain consistency in the pricing of goods across the board. And what Keynes did was break everything. The first thing he did was create a consumption function based on income. This, in terms of those who understand general equilibrium, is an aberration. General equilibrium functions do not consider quantities, they consider all prices. In fact, let's say a general equilibrium model is determined by preferences, endowments, and technology. And if you remove excess demand, they rely on prices. Income is not visible there, that is one thing. Income is derived from the sale of my endowments and from my share in the profits. Hence, for instance, all the relevant information can be found in the prices. As Keynes was not an economist and had only taken a course with Marshall, the advocate of partial equilibrium, he came up with the idea of including income in the consumption function. And what did he do there? He disrupted the intertemporality of consumption, and therefore, let's say, saving became a residue. Next, in the subject of investment, the general theory is interesting because it has a beautiful chapter describing what investment criteria are like. And in the other one, it indicates that, well, fundamentally, the animal spirits, I possess coarser versions, but I am unable to execute it as the head of state. Thus, at present in the goods market, it shifts its focus to determining not to mention the interest rate, but it shifts its focus to determining the income. And now, with that income, it determines the demand for labor in the face of a job offer. With that, it determines the wage. And it has a couple of problems, because it lacks determining the level of prices, and it lacks determining the rate of interest. Therefore, he makes the decision, in an utterly euphoric manner, to ascertain the prevailing interest rate in the highly dynamic and volatile money market. I mean, which is crazy because the interest rate exists not because money exists, but because time exists. So he broke everything there. And also, does it need, how can there be an interest rate in a one-period model? They understand that it does not make sense, it is pointless. The interest rate is basically a matter that spans over time. Therefore, evidently, it had no theory of capital or anything similar to that. And then what did he do? Well, he examined and concluded that the price level, the state of the economy, was a markup over wages, indicating a significant disparity between the two. Yet another aberration. It completely obliterated the entire theory of value. Obviously, could such a monstrous creation actually work, right? It's truly mind-boggling. And then when it appeared, let's say it was evident that the Keynesian theory was not working, where it began to manifest clearly was with the acceleration of inflation. So what happened? Cedar gave, the multiplier that implied, actually involves a violation of the budget constraint. They expressed, hey, hold on, we acknowledge that we have gone too far, so let's return to the basics. However, in light of the defeat suffered by the Austrian school in that particular historical context, they ultimately chose to return to the path of Balra as a strategic decision. They built upon the work of Abraham Wall, a young mathematician who, back in the 1920s, let's say, provided a demonstration of equilibrium existence without relying on fixed-point theorems, a true genius. And with the arrival of Brouwer's fixed-point theorems in 56 and the Captain's, and in 57, the first for functions and the second with correspondence, we began working on the analysis of general equilibrium. And in general equilibrium, what do we basically study? Whether the equilibrium exists, if it is unique, and if it is stable. The remarkable thing about fixed-point theorems is that if we are working with sets that are closed, bounded, and let's say convex, and in the case of having continuous functions, we can apply Brouwer's theorem, and then the equilibrium will exist, be unique, and also be unique in nature, without any duplicates or repetitions. And in the case of correspondences, equilibrium will exist. We do not know if it is unique, and if we make some additional assumptions, either on the demand side or on the supply side, or on both sides, let's say, we can ensure uniqueness. And at the same time, if we know that the direct effects outweigh the cross effects, the matrices, let's say, with changes in demand versus prices, the direct effects outweigh the cross ones. The matrix is defined as negative, and therefore the equilibrium is established, meaning that the problem of equilibrium existing, being unique, and being stable is resolved. Up until now, we have not encountered any problems because we can maintain continuity through a clear understanding of our work, or in cases where there may be confusion or a slightly higher level of complexity, through correspondence. This enables us to ensure what we need without facing any problems regarding existence. Therefore, we can confidently say that we have not experienced any issues thus far. And where does the problem arise then? The problem arises when we have the desire to achieve Pareto optimality. That is, when we have the intention to incorporate properties related to well-being into the equilibrium that we now have knowledge of its existence, which is both unique and stable. When we frame that problem in terms of welfare, how is it resolved and what is the solution? The concept is that, let's assume, if all individuals guided by their own self-interest, let's name it maximizing their usefulness, results in the utmost overall well-being, what we would require is for all participants to be maximizing. And when we, let's say, frame it in terms of the consumer not being a problem. And where does the problem arise now? It arises on the side of the firm, is the current source of the problem. So, one of the challenges we will encounter is that they are unable to accept increasing returns, because in that case, the production functions would be convex functions, and therefore they would not be able to find a maximum unless they are able to find it at an edge, which poses a significant limitation to their capabilities. But if they found it on an edge, what would that imply? That they take over the entire economy. So when they look and there are several companies, that means it's not a problem. And when they ended up with a single agent in an economy, that happened in communism. And we already know it was a failure because it couldn't compute prices, therefore it doesn't work. Therefore, a decision was made to avert attention, and that is the manner in which it remained. In Varian's book, which is surely at an intermediate level, and from my point of view the best, do you know how many times the word entrepreneur is mentioned in the book? There is no company. And what about the company? It has occurred 4 times. When I say firms, I mean, do you believe that the role of the entrepreneur is only to solve a problem described by the Lagrangian equation? It would be quite simple, the task of the entrepreneur. And that is something that God overlooked in this particular situation. And that is the thing that is preventing us from properly understanding and capturing the issue of increasing returns. And that problem of desiring to conduct welfare analysis resulted in the utilization of inadequate mathematical constructions, which leave us with either constant returns to scale or diminishing marginal returns. If reality differs from the model, we label it as a market failure and provide justification for intervention. Providing justification for intervention results in more unfavorable outcomes. And what is the problem with all of this? As we make more and more progress with regulations, we will increasingly be jeopardizing the potential for achieving higher returns on investment. And when we are killing increasing returns, as we will be killing profit generation, we will be killing the incentives to innovate. And if we kill the incentives to innovate, we won't grow anymore. Therefore, I suggest, because I no longer have the time, to actively read a work by Murray Newton Rothbard, the inventor of anarcho-capitalism, called Monopoly Competition, which is part of a wonderful book that I also recommend reading the 3 volumes of, called Man, Economy, and State. The 3rd volume is titled Power and Market, but it is a part of the same work. In this volume, Rothbard adopts an anarcho-capitalist perspective to make them open their eyes and broaden their perspective. And the thing is, monopolies are not bad. If I have 10 companies and one creates a product, let's say a higher quality cell phone at a better price, what do you think will happen to the other 9? They will go bankrupt. But the entrepreneur who bankrupted the other 9 is a social benefactor, as he provides me with higher quality goods at better prices, thus giving me better service on my cell phone and enabling me to consume other goods, making my life easier. And then, no, well, but what will you do with the money you earn? Why should I care? If you save, it becomes an investment elsewhere. If he reinvests it, his company will grow more. He will give me even better cell phones, pay higher salaries, I will save more money, and I will do a lot of other things. Fantastic. So what is the problem? Or the other thing, look, this guy is so bad, he is such a villain. Do you know how he manages to accumulate all the money that he earns? Do you bury it in the ground? Do you bury it even if, for example, it ends up like a crater, correct? If you do that, you're withdrawing money from the economy. Thus, the price level is decreased and we all derive advantages. So let's not fear, let's progress, let's stay positive. We're uncertain about the future. The only certainty is that it will improve significantly, and it will be much better if we remove the state from all aspects of our lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. I have